is actually something that I'm interested in too. There were a number of questions about density. Density. There's a question from Alex about density without loudness. Angel asked about sort of wall of sound techniques without getting things too busy.
If you put a Coke can in a bowl of water, it floats, and if you put Diet Coke in a Diet Coke can in water, it sinks. Apparently, different densities. Look that shit up. Some physics stuff. I don't know.
Damn, that's some physics shit. So how does that apply to mixes? The other question was about
don't use artificial sweeteners in your mixes. Decide what needs to be sweet and what doesn't need to be sweet, so it always floats.
It seems like density.
I don't know. I was trying.
Yeah, I like the attempt. When we've talked about density in the past, it really is a combination of, for lack of a better word, everything. It's a combination of arrangement. So are the parts running into each other note-wise? Are the sounds running into each other frequency-wise? When you're layering things on top of each other, are there EQ adjustments to make? Are you compressing or saturating, distorting in certain ways that are blending things together? How do you? It seems like the answer to density is it's a bit of everything. And to be frank, that's the thing that really good mix engineers know how to deal with. They understand the subtleties of, okay, this arrangement is good, but I can carve out a little bit here. I can boost this a little bit here. I can put a little more reverb on this here and separate, but still make it loud.
There's a few ways to come into this. When I think of density, I think of, am I creating the density, or am I how do I say this? What's creating the density? Is it the arrangement is dense, or is it a limiter or the mix bus that someone had on their mix, on their rough mix, that's creating the density, right? So, for example, I was working on this trap record today, right before. I'm still working on it. I took a break, and I'll go back after this. And it's so crushed together with a L3 or whatever, that ultra maximizer. I don't have waves, so as we all know. And it's just so, Josh was telling me how just smashed it was. Right? So the density is coming from a limiter, not the arrangement. The arrangement has 6 elements in the whole track, and then a ton of vocals. But in the track, it's 6 elements. And it sounds, without that limiter, the song does not sound the same. The instrumental does not sound there's no representation of it in the raw sound. That to me is just kind of wrong. I don't know how else to put it. Like, sound design your sounds individually so then they take up the space you want without relying on a 9 to 10 dB reduction limiter. Like, that to me is so backwards, and it's actually really frustrating. So that's where I'd like to come at it from an arrangement standpoint, is make sure your arrangement is dense enough and placed in the right way, not relying on a limiter. We talked about that last time with when we talked about compression. This is why I'm so against the idea of compression as a go-to, as a necessity, is because that's how people are creating their density. When that falls apart, it all goes to shit. And that's not fair, because honestly, like, I think, granted, everything is subjective. I think that my mix objectively is much better, way improved. Because of how limited it was, there's no sub frequencies, and it's a trap record with an 808. Like, now it's sitting low and it's moving. You can actually hear the subtleties in the bass that are moving around. I couldn't tell the difference between any of the notes. Couldn't tell the difference between the kick and the snare, because they were so smashed that the pitch of the kick and the snare sounded exactly the same, because they each have hi-hats from like a sample loop. So it sounds, they sounded basically the same. And now there's a separation, there's a groove, and there's a feel to it. And without the limiter, now my nerve when I finish it today, when I send it to them, is that they're not going to like it because it sounds different. And they'll be unable to hear the improvement or feel the improvement because demoitis. And that's always the fear that happens with this. So what I did to improve my chances of success was I recreated the density, like we talk about with certain pieces of gear and certain tools, with exciters and saturation tools. So I could remake specifically where that limiter was hitting that kick that gave that upper mid-range in the kick that doesn't exist. Like, if you look at the kick itself and put an analyzer on it, there's no top end to the kick or no mid-range to the kick. It's all low. But somehow the way it's hitting the compressor, all of a sudden there's like a knock to it. The knock, I swear to God, does not exist. So I have to recreate that density. So there are ways to recreate it without using an overall crushing limiter that's dictating the density of the record versus, do you actually have mid-range in your kick choice? do you have that knock in the choice? Like most producers, I don't have to do that type of shit for, because they're, or at least the ones that I'm working on that I don't have to fix as much and I get to enhance. Today was a little bit of a different story. Also, in the defense of the record, the vocal is one of my favorite vocals that I've worked on. This artist is so dope, and like I want her to slay. Like I'm giving it my all because I actually believe in this artist. So I'm not trying to complain about it. It's okay to make it bump and also have that texture and that density. There needs to be bold moves taken into account. So that's the way I think about density. You can always add it. It's hard to take it away unless you're just turning things down, but then your chances of beating the rough are minimal. But that's the reverse. The reverse would be it's so dense with no compressor on, everything's just loud. It's like, okay, maybe I guess that's when you start carving EQ and making minimal adjustments and doing surgical moves.
Well, so a lot of what you're talking about sounds like when you're talking about density is treating individual elements in distinct ways. Mm-hmm. So they have their own, for lack of a better term, identity. They sit in their own space. Sometimes that's frequency range.
But in the arrangement, dictated by the arrangement, not by a tool such as a compressor or a limiter dictating the arrangement.
So when
and the density.
I assume a lot of people have an idea of what arrangement means, but arrangement is the combination of both instruments and sounds, the elements that you have and how they interact with each other. And a lot of times when
across time
as well. Yeah. So when something has maybe a bad arrangement, that can mean that things are static over the course of a song. And so things don't really ebb and flow and change. A bad arrangement might be, you have
everything exists in the low mids, and there's
everything
nothing
exists in the same frequency range, and not just equalization frequency range, but there's a guitar part that's roughly in the same melody range as the vocal, and so you don't get clarity there. I actually was working on a song that I wrote with an artist a couple of weeks ago, and he had sent me like 7 guitar ideas to put in this one section, and I love this one particular sound, and I kept kind of poking at it every night because there isn't really a deadline. We're just writing for his next album. And I kept going back to it, and I was like, I want this to work. And I tried a different amp sound, and I tried a different EQ, and I tried some phasing, and and it just wasn't right. And then I realized the top note of the 2-note guitar part is right in line where the vocal is. And I just went, that's what it is. So I went and played a version of his guitar part in a slightly different voicing, and so all of a sudden the vocal and the guitar part sat like this, as opposed to being like the 2 notes on the guitar and the vocal were kind of doing this, and then all of a sudden went like this, and it just absolutely opened up, and then it worked.
Yeah, see, that's a great point. I mean, I remember being in production sessions and with my partner at the time, and we would never, the tone would come up pretty fast because tones are tones, but you're always looking for that top note, that bottom note, what reinforces the melody. Like it could take hours to dial in the right voicing of a chord on a guitar for a pop song, and 4 minutes for the tone to be found, or 30 seconds to be. I mean, it's so much more important to think that way, arrangement wise. What's supporting and enhancing the melody and not distracting from? So yeah, I mean, I kind of think my experience as a producer is what led to that in mixing for me. I mean, I'm always in what I call solo mode for that reason. I just solo a few elements at a time and kind of see what's getting in the way. And granted, I only have control maybe over the frequency spectrum of that now that it's already desired. But with tools these days, if a note is ringing out too much in the guitar, I can get that out with EQ to a degree, at least enough to decoy it and create space for the melody to exist in that same range.
I've done that sometimes in the mix where I'll either triggering with the vocal or doing some multiband compression on a particular area where there's a part that's just kind of stomping on the vocal and just pulling it out when the vocal sings.
Yeah, you can sidechain it to the vocal. And those kind of moves. Yeah. And also back to the density thing and an arrangement. I forgot what I was going to say. Damn, that sucks.
Somebody asked in there, are you putting saturation and things like that on individual elements versus mix bus stuff? And I think it's
not on mix bus, but subgroups and individuals, mostly individuals. But sometimes subgroups.
Yeah, just the idea of voicing things correctly in the arrangement, getting things out of each other's way, and then doing the same with EQ is sort of like, if you go step by step, it's like create the arrangement so the notes and the sounds kind of add up, and then you get further and further along in the process. Then you start worrying about frequency ranges and things like that.
Yeah, I remember what I was going to say, and it has a lot to do with this. We should talk about filtering. I think filtering is more important. A more important form of EQ than anything else. So when thinking about arrangement, you don't need talk numbers for a second. In a guitar, you don't really need 12K and up in the guitar. Like maybe if you're going for super hi-fi Steely Dan, like, do you really want that though? Like really sparkly guitar? Maybe Mutt Lange would leave some of that in, but really you can condense that down, and proper monitoring is what lets you hear when you don't need above a certain area. Does your snare really need to crack at 8K when that's where the vocal is sitting? Like, you should really be specific on where. So I rarely do anything more than filtering on a lot of stuff, or just getting that bottom up to the right spot, getting maybe a phase bump at the bottom that gives a little poke in the lowest bit. And then same with the top. There's a filter on every sound in my session. Really? And that helps with density in the overall mix, because you're giving yourself the headroom. You're not letting things have too much low end when they don't need it. And obviously, use your discretion, because sometimes you want rumble and you want mystery and you want things that are not perfect on top of each other. I'm not talking about being the most precise that you can be with that. I think there's some leeway. But filtering to me is actually the most important EQ.
This is a really big thing, because I fuck this up a lot. I'm constantly... This is really good. This is going to change how I think about some things. And I've done bits of this before, and I never really stick to it. Whenever I'm listening to the drums of a beat I'm making, or I'm just like turning up high end, and I'm turning, like I want the snare to crack more, so I turn up 8K and it cracks more, and that's awesome. And then when I'm getting into making it more dense, things are kind of, the snare is not as clear, and then the vocals got to be louder, and then I'm turning everything up. And the reality is that snare drum should not have all that high end in this, for the most part, because that's where the vocal's going to sit, and the cymbals are going to sit in a slightly different place, and maybe the hats are going to, maybe the hats will be here, and the snare is here, and the vocals here, and the crash is here, and instead of having everything where I'm just cranking up high end because it sounds so good to me.
And to me, that's more of a pitch thing. That's like when you're producing. You're trying lower pitches of hi-hats, so you don't have to add brightness, or you're trying higher pitches. Sorry. You're going to raise the pitch of the hats. You don't have to add high end. You're just flipping it up until it's not in the way of the vocal, or it's so far above the vocal and then the vocal sitting below the hi-hat, depending on what you're going for, or pitch things down out of the way instead of darkening them, right? That's in the producer world in arrangement. I do that in mixing too, just to see what I can do, or put like a heavy saturation tool, like a cassette deck, like Sketch cassette on a hi-hat. It completely changes the vibe of the hi-hat, sometimes magically, for the better, or sometimes it's way too drastic and you're like, oh, that's too much. I think that you thinking about boosting high end is the go-to for something where you're like, oh, it's not bright enough.
I want it to be clearer. I want it to
exactly.
be yeah.
And in fact, to me, it's the complete opposite. In fact, it's like I want less of that to make it more clear, because you have less of that and it actually gives the fundamental of that sound more space to breathe, right? So say that hi-hat pitch is actually sitting at a peak on an analyzer at 4 or 5K. Why are you boosting 8K? That's not the sound, right? The sound itself, if you want it to sit in that range, you'd pitch it up 4 semitones, and then it naturally sits in that range. Now, I wouldn't want the hi-hat to be in that range necessarily, because that's where the vocal is supposed to sit, or a buzzy Prophet synth, the top of that sitting like between 10 and 15 for that air and that like crunch that an analog synth actually gives. That buzz is kind of up there, depending on obviously where your resonant filter is set. But that's kind of notorious where those vintage synths sit, and nothing above it. They all have smooth roll-offs by like 15K.
What's something that philosophically is pretty interesting to think about, which I make this mistake a lot, so I can't imagine I'm alone in it, that listening to things in isolation is important to a point, but it's really how it all adds up, and it gets back to arrangement. This is arrangement, this is density, this is EQ, this is everything, where you're really, how everything adds up is ultimately the most important thing. I've received productions that I'm finishing or mixes that I've done where I'm surprised by how narrow of a set of frequencies the snare drum is and things like that, but it just cracks in the song because it has hi-hats and a vocal and a high synth and all that kind of stuff. And so, you know,
I have to say to that, I can't remember the last time I soloed one element to work on it. That's something that is probably controversial, or
no, it makes a lot of sense based on what we're talking about.
I don't remember the last time I soloed one thing to work on, unless it was to get rid of a click or a bad edit or something. But to make an EQ move, I never EQ. So I think I could say that, 100%. I don't think I ever EQ alone. I might EQ with two elements, but I'll never solo to EQ. I think I did that when I was younger. And then everything sounded great individually, but then there was no glue together. I do that a lot. Yeah, I think most people do. And I think I did up until I met Tony. I think Tony was the one that kept saying, yo, you're soloed too long. Like he would solo things. We all do it. I don't actually think I do it anymore. But he used to. And if I did it for too long, he pointed out, he'd be like, hey man, you're like soloed too much. Or the other option is your vocal's muted for too long. Like, don't mix the instrumental for too long without the vocal in, because then you're going to mix around the vocal where the vocal's supposed to sit. At this point, I know kind of where I want my vocal to sit, so I can do it for longer than I think other people should, but that's a practice thing. I kind of know my handicap and where I want the vocal to sit, so I'm constantly I'm subconsciously scooping out regions for that to fit, for the vocal to fit in anyway. Well, so I have good results.
Somebody said to me last night that, and I think this is pretty true. I think as far as music consumers, this is not true, but as far as music creators, everybody undervalues the vocal. Yeah. I think everybody doesn't pay enough attention to the vocal.
Besides the vocalist.
Besides the vocalist. And the vocal is the most important thing, the most important thing, the most important thing. It's what everybody remembers. You know, occasionally you'll remember, like a classic keyboard line from a hit song, but
a counter melody.
But it's 99% of the time what people remember from the kind of music that we're making is the vocal, the melody, the lyric,
and the groove, and maybe the beat,
and the groove, and how it interacts with that. So when talking about arrangement, that's almost like you can, in my mind, think of it as a hierarchy. It's vocal, groove, and everything else. When you're talking about just arranging, producing, mixing, that sort of thing, it's vocal, groove, and then everything else, and everything else is kind of a distant third.
That's kind of what exactly it is. And our brains only can hear three different things at the same time anyway. So it's always going to compete for that thing. You don't want it to compete for the vocal. Nothing should compete with the vocal. And that's why I'm kind of against the vocal up note. Vocal up note to me at this point, because I love mixing vocals, is something's in the way of the vocal and needs to come down. Especially how fine my moves are with headroom and gain structure. The vocal is not too quiet. It's just something in the arrangement is getting in the way, and I might not have nailed the sculpting of that. So I don't remember the last time I just turned a vocal up. It's like, oh, that's the move. When someone asks for it, it's always, ooh, why are they saying that? And then you're kind of thinking psychologically about what's getting in the way of that and why they're not feeling the vocal where it's supposed to be. And it could be more of a presence EQ thing than a raise. Like every once in a while, I'll scoop out too much high mid-range in the vocal. Maybe I'm monitoring too loud or something. And then someone will say, oh, the vocal's not loud enough. And I'll double check that. And then I'll split the difference. I'm like, oh, that's it. Magic. What did you do? I'm like, oh, I don't, why do I have to tell you what I did necessarily? But I didn't turn the vocal up is the key to that answer. I don't believe in vocal up mixes. When everybody asks me, my response is, let's get it right. It's always that. And no one fights back. Like, oh, we need it. It's like, it's a thing to ask for. I don't think that's something that needs to be asked for.
I like the technique you were saying earlier about soloing in groups, soloing the vocal in a few instruments, soloing the vocal and drums.
The mute the drums mix is so fun. Like everything but drums, and see how the vocal is held in place. And then you drop your drums back in and you're like, wait, where'd the vocal go? That's when you realize you boosted too much high end on your snare and your hi-hats.
I've definitely done that.
That's a big move.
That's when people talk about, when we've talked about in some of these chats about references and having things translate, people are often talking about, let's listen to it on a laptop, let's listen to it on a phone, let's listen to it in the car, what is your monitoring setup? But listening in different combinations of instruments is a really great way to get perspective on your song, on your mix, on your arrangement. Listening to different different pieces of the song together.
Man, it's so inspiring to mute the drums specifically and hear all the weird shit that's hidden below the drums. Like the producer clearly cared so much about the drums and the vocal, and like there's cool chords under here and cool squiggly synth lines or a guitar lead that's buried. I'm like, wait, what? That's the character. That's that nostalgic nod, that reference to something from your childhood, something from middle school that you were into, like in some sort of rock band. Or it's like, wait, why is that quiet? And then the normal like square wave synth is loud. It's like, what? Yeah. Everyone does the square wave synth. Like, let's get that gnarly guitar. Maybe we'll put a chorus on it and be more reminiscent of the 80s. Like, let's be specific about what our intentions are, what our frame point and reference points are.
That's a really good way to get into the arrangement, to really understand what's happening.
Just start muting things. So you can either solo or mute. I exist in solo just because I like to just keep adding things instead of unmuting things. I start the mix process with everything in all the time. So, because I want to hear the song in its completion most of the time. So I exist that way. Then I'll start soloing things. You can mute things too. I'm just calling it solo mode. You can go mute mode too.
Yeah, I love that.